Hello and welcome. I'm Ashley of The Ugly Sheep, and today we're going to talk about using our warping boards to measure our warp. So let's get started. First, we're going to make a loop with a knot in a contrasting thread color. This thread should be at least double the length of your warp. Next, we're going to measure from the middle of that loop through how long you need to have your warp. When you get to the length you need, we're going to put another knot with a loop in our yarn so that we can find it as we're measuring our warp. Then we're going to put our loop around the first of the group of 3 pegs along the top of our warping board, going over the next 2 pegs and then coming down and going back and forth over the width of the warping board until we reach that knot loop that we just made. If your knot does not fall exactly on one of your pegs, it is better to go to the peg that is a little longer than the warp you need versus a little shorter. And then you're going to go around that peg and then follow your path back up to those starting 3 pegs. This time you're going to go over the right hand peg on the warping board under that middle one and then tie a loop around that one on the left at the top. I also then push all of my warp measure threads back at each peg to make sure it's flush with the back of the board. Next, we're going to tie another loop the way we did for our measuring thread, except instead of starting where the 3 pegs where we crossed the yarn, we're going to start where at the other end of our warp. This puts all of our knots at the beginning of the warp when you have it already threaded on your loom so that they get cut off as we're separating our warp to put them through our heddles and our reed. Make sure to follow the path that you laid exactly, going up the warping board is 1 thread for your warp, and then taking your cross in the other direction than what you put on the first time, and coming down is the 2nd thread in your warp. My warp has 16 ends to the inch, so I will take my thread that I'm using for my warp and go up for 1, down for 2, until I get to 16, and that is the 1st inch. This is how I usually sit to measure my warp. I can go pretty fast once I get into the rhythm of my pattern, but it does require a few breaks for my back and my shoulders. Once you have measured enough ends for your 1st inch, we're going to take a thread that's about 18 inches long and knot the ends together to make a circle. We're going to take the center of the loop and put it under the threads and then over to pull the long tail through, but not all the way. And then you're going to pull the end close to the warp threads to tighten the loop over top of your threads. This is a counting thread, and if you do it every inch, it allows you to make sure that you can quickly tell how much warp you have already measured. Once you have measured all of your threads, we're going to make a loop around the final peg and knot it off before cutting our warp from the spool of yarn. Next, we're going to take 7 to 8 short pieces of yarn to tie off our warp. The first is going to be at the very start of our warp, where you can see I started pulling the warp away from the back edge of the warp. And then around the top of each side of the cross and the bottom of each side of the cross. A single choke point if you have a short warp, or 2 choke points if you have a longer warp like I do, and then a point at the very end of the warp. And here you can see where I do the placement for each of the ties for your warp. This is the one that goes at the very edge of your warp on the top side, next to you, before you get to your cross ties. And here you can see the one that I'm putting on the top left side of the cross. And what I do is I just do the initial cross like you are to make a knot or a bow and pull tight. And then I make a bow so that we make sure that it's easy to undo at the loom without scissors. We do not want to have to cut our warp ties off because that might cut our warp threads. Now that I have the bottom and top of the left side of my cross secured, I'm going through and making sure that all of the strings in my cross were accounted for before I tie off the right side of my cross. From there, I tie on my choke, which is going to be at the part of my warp that is just below my counting thread, and then you pull really tight to make sure that none of those threads can move. And then lastly, I tie off the very end of the warp. Once the warp is tied off, we are going to make a warping chain by putting our hand through that last place where we tied off and pulling the warp before it through. We will continue this process until we get to our cross at the very top of our board. At this point, we just take the rest of the warp off around the cross and we are done with our warp chain. Now that we have our warp chain, what are you going to make? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and share. See you next time.